In a luxurious restaurant, a wealthy man decides to transform a simple order into a spectacle of humiliation, believing himself to be above everyone around him. Before him, a seemingly ordinary waitress guards a past that no one there could imagine. What begins as a power game quickly transforms into a silent confrontation where words are worth more than money. And in a few minutes, a single answer turns the tables and exposes truths that no one was prepared to face. Before discovering how this story ends, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss surprising accounts like this one. Night fell over the Jardins neighborhood, with that silent elegance that only São Paulo knows how to offer when it decides to be beautiful. The amber lights of the lampposts mixed with the glow of the boutique windows, creating golden reflections on the sidewalk wet from the drizzle that had passed hours before. On Rua Augusta, between designer stores and award-winning architecture studios, Maison Verlaine stood discreetly, like someone who doesn't need to shout to be noticed. The facade of smoked glass and beige limestone communicated, even before any word was said, that one did not enter there without a reservation, and that a reservation was not enough. It was necessary to be expected. It was necessary to be recognized. On the inside, the main dining room breathed in a minor key, contained conversations, silver cutlery that touched the plates with millimeter precision, a discreet live violin in an alcove at the back. Every detail had been calculated by a Swiss designer hired specifically to create what he called silence with texture. The customers paid dearly for that silence, and the silence in turn created the illusion that the world outside simply did not exist. Mara Cavalcante existed in that silence as if she were part of the furniture. 34 years old, dark hair tied in a discreet bun, a simple cut black uniform, shoes that had already traveled too many kilometers without a single word of thanks. She moved between the tables with that invisible efficiency that good waiters cultivate over the years, present enough to anticipate an order, absent enough not to disturb a conversation. Customers rarely looked into her eyes. They pointed to the menu, indicated an empty glass, nodded without taking their eyes off their interlocutor, and she fulfilled everything with a calm that someone less attentive might mistake for indifference. It was not indifference. It was discipline. Long ago, Mara had learned to separate what she felt from what she showed. It was a skill developed first in academia, where young female researchers had to prove twice as much to be given half the consideration, and perfected later in the hospital corridors, when the doctor said her father's condition was serious and the health insurance forms came back with the word she had learned to hate, denied. That word had changed everything. Mara was 29 years old when she received a research scholarship in cognitive linguistics at the University of São Paulo. She had defended her master's dissertation with distinction, and her advisor, Professor Meirelles, had already begun to articulate a direct doctoral position in partnership with a Portuguese university. Her theme, the influence of medieval Latin phonological structures on the syntactic constructions of spoken Brazilian Portuguese in isolated communities of the Vale do Ribeira, had generated unusual interest in international congresses. She was, as her colleagues said with that mixture of admiration and envy, on a trajectory. Then her father fell ill. Seu Geraldo Cavalcante had been a widower for 7 years. He had raised Mara alone after her mother left, not by abandonment, but because of a disease that came quickly and without warning. He was a machine operator at a printing shop in Brás, a man of few words but unshakable loyalty. When the neurologist said the condition required immediate hospitalization, followed by continuous and highly specialized treatment, Seu Geraldo just looked at his daughter and said, "Don't worry about me, my daughter, go fix it," as if it were he who needed to console her. Mara fixed it, the only way she found. She abandoned the scholarship. She abandoned the doctorate. She sold the rented apartment she had in Pinheiros, used her savings, took out a loan, negotiated with clinics. And when all that was still not enough to maintain the long-term treatment, she applied for the job at Maison Verlaine. She spoke French fluently, having studied the language for 6 years, including a semester exchange in Montpellier during her undergraduate studies. The manager, Monsieur Alain, was impressed with her pronunciation during the interview, but not enough to pay beyond the standard rate. She accepted it anyway. That had been 5 years ago. 5 years of trays, of calibrated smiles, of nights that ended after midnight, of Sundays that sometimes did not exist. 5 years carrying an academic curriculum that no one in that dining room ever imagined existed, because no one thought to ask. To the customers of Maison Verlaine, she was the waitress. Period. A function, not a person, not a... On that Thursday in October, Mara had arrived at the restaurant at 5 p.m. for the night shift. Before entering, she stopped at the corner pharmacy to buy her father's medication, which had been out of stock at the public health clinic for the 3rd consecutive month. The small bottle cost the equivalent of 1/10 of her salary. She bought it without hesitation, mentally reorganized the week's budget, and entered the restaurant with that firm smile that had become, over time, a second skin. The room began to fill around 8 p.m. Mara served 3 tables in the central sector, the most sought after because they were close to the window overlooking the illuminated internal garden. They were tables for 2, usually occupied by couples or executives on discreet business dinners. She knew the rhythms of that space by heart. She knew when a conversation was turning sour by the way the couple stopped looking at each other. She knew when a deal was closed by the tone in which the wine was ordered, more celebratory, more generous. At 9:40 p.m., the door of Maison Verlaine opened and Raphael Drummond entered. Mara did not know his name at that moment. She only knew he was the type of man who entered a place as if the place had been built to receive him. 40-something years old, dark Italian-cut suit, tie loosened with the calculated sloppiness of someone who wants to seem relaxed, but cannot hide the rigidity in his shoulders. Beside him, a woman with shoulder-length brown hair, in a moss-green dress, who looked at the floor with that expression Mara had learned to recognize over the years of work. Someone who was there but preferred not to be. The maitre d' led them to table 3, the favorite in the room. Raphael Drummond sat down without waiting for the chair to be pulled out for his companion. She pulled her own chair out herself, slowly, without complaining. Mara approached with the menus. "Good evening. Welcome to Maison Verlaine. My name is Mara, and I will be responsible for your table tonight. May I bring some sparkling water to start?" The man looked at her the same way one looks at a sign on the street, without really seeing. "Still mineral water, French." And he turned his eyes back to his cell phone. Mara brought the water. She left the menus. She returned after a few minutes to take the order. The man was still on his cell phone. The woman beside him, Cecilia, as Mara would later discover, flipped through the menu with that excessive attention of someone trying to look busy so as not to have to speak. It was not a happy dinner. That was clear in every detail. Mara took Cecilia's order, a foie gras appetizer and the fish in caper sauce, and turned to Raphael. It was at this moment that he finally put down his cell phone. He looked at her with an expression Mara knew well. It was the expression of someone who is about to test something. Raphael Drummond folded the menu slowly, like someone closing a subject. He placed it on the table with that gesture some men use to mark territory, a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but loaded with intention. Then he looked at Mara, with an expression she could only describe if someone asked her, as that of someone who is about to give a lesson. "Je voudrais commencer avec le velouté de céleri rave, suivi du canard à l'orange avec une réduction de cassis, et pour accompagner, le Bordeaux que vous m'avez recommandé, mais pas le premier que vous avez mentionné, celui-là était trop tannique pour ce plat." He spoke slowly, with the exaggerated intonation of someone imitating an accent without actually having it, the vowels rounded more than necessary, the fricative consonants forced with that affectation of someone who learned French in a 3-month intensive course and decided that was enough to impress waitresses. There was a deliberate pause before réduction de cassis, as if he were waiting for her to frown. Cecilia looked at the tablecloth. Raphael waited, and the wait tasted of anticipation. Mara did not blink. She held his gaze for a moment, then lowered her eyes to the notepad with that professional gesture she had cultivated as a shield over the years, and then responded. "Bien sûr, monsieur. Permettez-moi tout de même de vous signaler que le velouté de céleri rave ce soir est accompagné d'une émulsion de noisettes grillées, ce qui pourrait modifier l'harmonie avec votre choix de Bordeaux. Si vous préférez maintenir cette sélection, je vous suggère plutôt le Bourgogne que nous avons reçu cette semaine. Quant à votre formulation, Je crois que vous souhaitiez dire une réduction de cassis, et non pas une réduction du cassis. La nuance est subtile, mais elle change le sens technique de la préparation. Silence. Not the elegant and calculated silence of the dining room. Another silence. The silence of something that stopped in the air before falling. Raphael Drummond blinked once. Then again. There was in his eyes that fraction of a second when the face has not yet received orders from wounded pride and shows, for a fleeting instant, what it is actually feeling. Surprise. A genuine surprise that he tried to cover up immediately, but that Mara saw. She always saw that kind of thing. Le Bordeaux convient très bien, he said, shorter, drier. Comme vous le souhaitez, she replied, and noted it down. As she walked away toward the pantry, Mara felt two pairs of eyes on her back. One was Raphael's, following her with that expression of a man whose calculation went wrong and who has not yet decided what to do with it. The other was that of a gentleman sitting at table 6, in the corner of the room, partially hidden by an arrangement of white carnations. He had raised his eyes from his plate at the exact moment she had responded in French, not with the startled curiosity of the others who had heard, but with something different. Recognition, perhaps, or real attention. Mara gave it no importance. She had orders to deliver. The night continued. She served Raphael's velouté, which was received without comment. She brought the Bourgogne she had suggested to Cecilia, who accepted it with a small and genuine smile, her first since arriving. She served the canard. She filled the glasses. She maintained the rhythm. But something had changed at table 3. Raphael Drummond had put away his phone and was now drinking the wine with the expression of someone calculating the next moves of a game. Cecilia ate in silence, with that distant look of someone present in body, but absent in everything else. From time to time he said something in a low voice, and she answered with monosyllables. It was not an argument. It was worse. It was the absence of anything that resembled a real dialogue. At table 6, the man with grey hair and a charcoal grey suit drank a chablis with the deliberation of someone in no hurry for anything. He was alone, which was unusual in that type of restaurant on a Thursday night. There was a black leather briefcase on the chair beside him, but not open, just placed there like someone who arrives with the intention of working but decides that dinner is not the time. He was, Mara mentally estimated, about 55 years old. Angular face, serene expression without being cold. The type of serenity that is not an absence of intensity, but control of it. She brought him dessert, an île flottante, and he thanked her with that brief nod of the head that people of true education use when speaking to someone most people pretend not to see. You are doing very well tonight, he said in Portuguese, low, without any condescension. It was the simple observation of someone who watched something with attention. Mara smiled professionally. Thank you, sir. Can I bring you anything else? No, for now, thank you. She walked away. And as she walked away, she thought it was curious how some people managed to say a lot with very little, and others said very little with a huge amount of words. The problem happened at 11:15 p.m. Raphael Drummond called Mara with a sharp wave while she was attending the next table. She excused herself from the other customers and approached. He had finished dinner. The small plate with the bill was on the table, and Raphael, standing up with his jacket on his arm, had an expression in his eyes that she had not seen before that night. It was no longer the expression of the man calculating. It was the expression of someone who had made a decision. My card is not in my wallet. Mara looked at him calmly. Would you like to try checking again? Sometimes... I know where my cards are. The voice was cold, cutting. It was here when I arrived, and now it isn't. Pause. And you were the only person circulating around this table all night. The room did not stop, but it became quieter. That kind of quietness that happens when people continue doing what they are doing, but turn off a part of their attention to what is happening at a specific point in space. Mara felt the stares as if they were temperature. Cecilia, who was getting up to grab her purse, stopped mid-movement. She looked at Raphael. She looked at Mara. And she said nothing. Sir, Mara said, with her voice in exactly the same tone as always, without trembling, without rising. I am very sorry for what happened. I will call the manager immediately so we can resolve this in the best way possible. What needs to be resolved, Raphael said, louder now, is knowing where my card is. And the way he said that, with that rhythmic emphasis on the last words, made it absolutely clear to everyone listening what the unspoken accusation was. Mara Cavalcante felt the weight of it landing on her like something physical. 5 years at Maison Verlaine, 5 years without a single occurrence, 5 years of silence and efficiency and worn-out shoes and medication bills, and her father's face when she arrived home late and he pretended he had slept so she wouldn't feel guilty for arriving late. All of that passed through her head in less than 3 seconds, and she didn't move a single muscle in her face. Monsieur Alain Ferreira arrived in the dining room with that discreet urgency that managers of high-standard restaurants develop over the years, fast enough to show the matter is serious, but slow enough not to alarm the other customers. He was a small man, with a thin moustache and impeccable posture, who had spent 16 years learning that a restaurant like Maison Verlaine survived not just by the food, but by the careful management of impressions. And the impression he was trying to manage now was delicate. "Mr. Drummond, what a regrettable situation. We will resolve this immediately," he said, with that placating intonation that was almost a language in itself. "May I ask at what moment you noticed?" "Now, when I went to get the card to pay." Raphael maintained the tone of someone who had already decided where the problem lay and was not interested in revisiting the question. "I checked the whole wallet. It's not there." "And are you sure you brought it?" The question was asked softly, but Raphael received it as an insult. "Of course I'm sure I don't leave home without my cards." Monsieur Alain nodded. Then he looked at Mara, who was 2 steps away, upright, with her hands joined in front of her uniform, with that expression she had perfected over the years, neutral without being empty, attentive without being anxious. He had known her for 5 years. He knew her history, her punctuality, her discretion, the way she had learned, without anyone needing to teach her, that Maison Verlaine functioned according to its own grammar. But he also knew that Raphael Drummond had been a customer for 3 years, that he was the type of customer who always reserved on Thursdays, who brought business partners frequently, who spent well and complained little, until tonight. "Mara," he said, with a neutrality that she recognized not as confidence, but as caution, "the gentleman is pointing out a serious situation. Do you have anything to clarify?" "Nothing to clarify," she replied simply. "I never approach the gentleman's belongings." "Of course she would say that," Raphael said, not to Alain, but to the room in general, with that voice projection of someone accustomed to being heard even when speaking to walls. "What I know is that the card was in my wallet when I arrived and now it's gone, and this girl was the only one circulating by the table." Cecilia, still standing beside the chair, made a gesture with her hand, very small, almost imperceptible. It was not a gesture of agreement. It was the gesture of someone about to say something and stopping mid-movement, before deciding they won't. Mara saw it. She kept it. The room had cooled a few degrees without anyone turning on the air conditioning. The conversations at the other tables continued, but with that veil of divided attention that people use when they pretend not to be listening and are listening to every syllable. A woman at table 2 had touched her spoon to the edge of the plate. A couple at table 5 looked at each other with that discreet complicity of those experiencing something they will tell later. And then, from table 6, came a voice. "Excuse me." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It had that quality of voice that cuts through ambient noise not by volume, but by density, like an orchestral instrument that you hear even when all the others are playing. The man with grey hair had placed his napkin on the table carefully. He stood up slowly. He walked toward the small group with a cadence that was neither urgent nor hesitant. It was the cadence of someone who is exactly where he decided to be. "I was sitting in this position all night," he said, addressing Monsieur Alain, but with the tone of someone speaking to everyone listening, "and I can assure you that the young waitress at no point approached the gentleman's belongings outside of what would be expected in the service. She brought plates, collected plates, and served wine. That is all." Raphael stared at him with that expression power-hungry men use when another man enters their territory uninvited. "And who are you, exactly?" "I am a customer," he replied, with a simplicity that bordered on irony. "Just like you. I appreciate the willingness, but this is none of your business." "Perhaps it wouldn't be," the man said, without moving, without raising his tone. "But the situation has reached a point where a competent professional is being publicly constrained by an accusation that does not withstand a simple observation. Before any conclusion, I suggest you check your jacket." Silence. Raphael looked at the man. He looked at the jacket he had placed over his arm when he stood up, and there was something in that moment, a very thin crack in the armor, that Mara recognized as the instant when a person begins to realize they made a mistake, but doesn't yet know how to get out without getting hurt. "My card is not in my jacket. I already checked the wallet." "The jacket, not the wallet," the man said, with patience that was not passivity. "The inner pocket on the left side." Cecilia took a deep breath. It was an almost inaudible sound, but Mara was close enough to hear. Raphael stood still for 2 seconds. Then, with a movement that tried to look routine and was not, he put his hand in the inner pocket of his jacket. His fingers found something, a pause. He took his hand out slowly. The card was there. It was one of those moments when time seems to change speed. It doesn't accelerate. It doesn't stop. It just becomes different, denser, as if each second needed to be processed separately before the next could begin. Monsieur Alain closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. He opened them again with his professional expression intact, but there was in his shoulders a minimal relaxation that revealed how tense he had been. Mara said nothing. There was nothing to say. The situation had said everything for her. Raphael Drummond looked at the card in his own hand with the expression of a man who is calculating, in real time, what the least damaging position to take would be. There was anger in that look, but not the anger from before, the anger of someone convinced. It was the most difficult anger to manage, the anger of someone who knows they were wrong and has nowhere to redirect it. "It must have fallen in here when I took off the jacket," he said finally. No one at the table agreed. No one disagreed. The silence was the most eloquent response possible. Cecilia grabbed her purse. She looked at Raphael with an expression that Mara could only describe as that of someone seeing clearly something they had tried not to see for a long time. There was no drama in that look. There was only recognition. "I am going to pay my share," Cecilia said, opening her wallet. "Cecilia." "My share," she repeated, with that soft firmness that is sometimes more definitive than any shout. The man with grey hair returned to table 6 with the same calm step with which he had stood up. He sat down. He picked up the glass of Chablis, which still had a bit of wine at the bottom. He looked at Mara, who was still standing in the same place, and gave that brief nod of the head from before, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, when in fact everything had changed. Mara responded with an equally discreet nod, and then she went to get the machine to process Cecilia's payment, while the room slowly, molecule by molecule, returned to breathing normally. Maison Verlaine closed at 12:40 a.m. The last customer to leave was a couple from table 8 who had ordered a second bottle of white wine around 11:30, and then stayed talking with that carefreeness of those who have no commitment the next morning. Mara accompanied them to the exit, wished them a good night, and then returned to help with the final organization of the room. The man from table 6 had left earlier. He had asked for the bill around 11 p.m., paid with a card, thanked her with that same brief nod as before, and left with the black leather briefcase under his arm. He had said nothing more to Mara besides what he had already said. He had made no dramatic gesture. He simply left, like someone concluding a matter without needing an exclamation point. She kept thinking about him while she collected the glasses from table 6. It was not common for someone to intervene in that way. Not in an environment like that, where the unwritten rule was that everyone took care of their own dinner and their own conversation, and much less in the way he had done it, without confrontation, without raising his voice, only with the strength of a precise observation placed at the exact moment. There was something in that intervention that seemed less like an impulse and more like a deliberate choice. Monsieur Alain waited until the other employees were in the pantry before approaching Mara. "That was uncomfortable," he said, in a low voice. "It was," she agreed, without ornaments. He stayed in silence for a moment, with that expression of someone organizing what he wants to say before saying it. "You handled yourself well, better than I did." A pause. "Drummond will call tomorrow, maybe with an excuse, maybe with something else. Either way, let it be on record that you were completely correct tonight." Mara looked at him. "Thank you, Alain." He nodded and left. He was the type of man who managed to be both fair and uncomfortable with his own fairness, as if recognition cost something he wasn't sure he could spend. She caught the bus on Avenida Paulista at 1:20 in the morning. The bus was almost empty. Just a woman with a grocery bag and two young men sleeping with their heads against the glass. Mara sat near the window, put an earbud in one ear without turning anything on, and watched the city passing by outside. São Paulo at 1 in the morning had that raw beauty she had learned to appreciate over the years. Not the postcard beauty, not the beauty outsiders imagined when they thought of the city. It was a beauty of resistance, of lights on in the high floors of buildings where someone was still awake working, of pastry stalls closing in a hurry, of security guards greeting cameras with no one on the other side. It was the beauty of a city that never stopped, and that had learned to confuse movement with progress. She had loved this city forever. She had studied its language, its syntactic contradictions, the way Paulistanos shortened open vowels and elongated stressed syllables in a way that didn't exist anywhere else in the country. She had written an essay about it back in undergraduate school, an essay Professor Mirels had called brilliant and disturbing in the best sense of the term. Professor Mirels. She hadn't thought about him in months. She got off at the Ipiranga stop and walked the 6 blocks to the house where she lived with her father. It was a corner house, built in the 70s, which had belonged to her maternal grandmother and which Seu Geraldo had taken care of with that silent dedication he put into everything. The sidewalk was swept. The creeper growing on the side had been pruned last week, something he managed to do with help from the neighbor, Donna Yvonne, while Mara worked. She opened the gate slowly. She entered the living room in silence. The hallway light was on. It always stayed on, for her, for when she arrived. It was an unspoken agreement between them, a way of saying, "I'm here. You arrived safely. You can rest." She went to her father's room, cracked the door open carefully. Seu Geraldo slept with that rhythmic breathing the neurologist said was a good sign, regular, without effort. The device beside the bed blinked green. Mara stood looking at him for a few seconds. He had been a man of simple words and solid gestures. He taught Mara to ride a bike on an August Sunday, holding the bike seat without saying he had let go, letting her discover on her own that she was already pedaling without support. He had gone to all her school performances, to all her academic defenses, sitting in the back with a blazer of a color that matched the napkin in his pocket, trying to look at ease in an environment that was not his. He had applauded louder than everyone when she defended her masters, and she had seen at that moment that his eyes were red. Now he slept, and the words he had pronounced so easily throughout their whole life together had become trapped somewhere between the brain and the throat, in a clot of silence that the treatment tried, with slow steps, to dissolve. Mara closed the door with the same care she had opened it. There were things she needed to do before sleeping. Verify the medications for the next day, check the scheduling email for the next appointment with the speech therapist, prepare the shopping list for Saturday. They were small mechanical tasks that she had incorporated into her routine, with the same naturalness as she had incorporated carrying trays and smiling at customers who didn't look in her eyes. But before doing any of them, she went to the bookshelf in the living room and pulled out a book. Not by chance. She went straight to what she wanted, like someone who knows the exact place of everything. It was a historical grammar of Portuguese by João Ribeiro, an old edition with a faded cover that had belonged to Professor Mirels, and that he had given her as a gift when she defended her masters. "So as not to lose the thread," he had said, smiling. She opened to any page, read 2 paragraphs, closed it. There was a phrase that had accompanied her since her days in academia, a phrase she had found in a historical linguistics article, and that she had underlined in red because it had struck her in a way she didn't expect. The phrase said that a language is not just a system of communication, but a system of survival, that people carry in the way they speak the entire history of what they needed to be to continue existing. She had thought a lot about that phrase over the last 5 years. She went to bed at 2 a.m. without knowing that, at that same hour on the other side of the city, in a penthouse apartment in Jardins, the man from table 6 opened his computer and typed her name. Mara Cavalcante, researcher, cognitive linguistics, USP. The information appeared in a sequence he read with increasing attention. The master's dissertation, the article published in a Portuguese journal, the interrupted research scholarship. He stared at the screen for a long moment. Then he closed the computer, turned off the living room light, and went to sleep, with the expression of someone who just found something they were looking for without knowing exactly what it was. On the following Friday, Raphael Drummond called Maison Verlaine at 6 p.m. Monsieur Alain answered. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. Mara was in the locker room putting on her uniform when the manager appeared at the door, with that expression that tried to be neutral and wasn't completely. "It was Drummond," he said. "I imagine," she replied, without stopping adjusting her bun. "He said he was calling to clarify what happened, that it was a moment of confusion, that he regrets any misunderstanding." Alain stopped. He didn't apologize exactly, but it was the closest someone of his profile gets to it. Mara looked at him through the mirror. "And what did you respond?" "I thanked him for the call, said that the restaurant maintained its position of total confidence in its employees." A pause. "And I cancelled the reservation for next Thursday that was in his name." She stayed in silence for a moment, then she nodded slowly. "Thank you." Alain disappeared. Mara stood looking at her own reflection a few seconds longer than necessary. There was something different in her face that afternoon, or maybe it was just the angle of the light. She couldn't name what it was. In the days that followed, life returned to its usual rhythm. The shift at Maison Verlaine, the pharmacy, the bus, the pruned creeper, the hallway light on, the medications lined up on the kitchen counter, the appointment with the speech therapist on Tuesday, where the specialist showed the progress graph of her father, with that containment of enthusiasm of someone who doesn't want to create unnecessary expectations, but whose eyes said the numbers were good. "Mr. Geraldo is responding better than the average patient at the same stage," the doctor said. "The treatment is working. We need consistency." Consistency. It was the word that had defined Mara's life for years. Consistency in work, consistency in care, consistency in the maintenance of a structure that had been built piece by piece, like a scaffold supporting something fragile. On the following Thursday, she arrived at Maison Verlaine and found an envelope on top of her locker in the dressing room. It had her name written by hand with firm and economical calligraphy. Inside, a simple business card, white background, black letters, the name Dr. Henrique Assunção. Below a title, Project Director, Mater Linguae Institute, and below the title, just one handwritten line. "If you are interested in talking, call when you can. There is no urgency. H.A." She turned the card over. The back was blank. She stood looking at it for a moment. Mater Linguae. She knew the name. Every linguistics researcher in Brazil knew the name. It was a private foundation created 12 years ago, financed by a consortium of companies and by donations from alumni of São Paulo universities, which had become, over the last decade, the main sponsor of applied linguistics research in the country. It had published works she had read and reread during her masters. It had promoted scholarships she had even considered, before deciding that the direct doctorate through USP was the fastest path. The fastest path to where she had not arrived. Mara put the card in her uniform pocket. She worked the entire shift with it there, able to feel it through the fabric every time she moved. She served 3 tables, recommended the duck confit to a couple on an anniversary, explained the difference between 2 southern wines to a man who was clearly buying information to seem knowledgeable in front of his friends, smiled, thanked, collected plates, and she thought, while doing all that, about what that card meant. It wasn't simple. It was never simple when an opening like that appeared. After so much time without any opening at all, there were many questions that a card like that generated, and Mara organized them mentally with that analytical habit that was as constitutive of her way of thinking as breathing itself. Who was Dr. Henrique Asunção, and how had he arrived at her name? What exactly was the Institute's project, and what did he expect from a conversation? And, more importantly, what would happen to her father while she navigated that possibility? She arrived home at 1:30 in the morning. Seu Geraldo was awake, which was unusual. He was sitting in the living room armchair, with the television muted, looking at the window. When Mara entered, he turned his face slowly, and in his eyes was that presence that sometimes appeared and that the doctor called windows. Moments when the fog surrounding communication opened for a few instants, and he was there, whole, the way he had always been. "Father," she said softly. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. There was a visible effort in that movement, like someone pushing a door that is stuck, and then it came out, small, hoarse, but unmistakable. "My daughter." Mara stopped in the middle of the room. 2 syllables, he had said only 2 syllables. But for months he hadn't said anything besides sounds without outline, vocalizations the speech therapist identified as attempts at articulation, but that didn't quite become recognizable words. And now he had said 2 syllables, clear, in the exact tone she had heard her whole life. She went to him, sat on the edge of the armchair beside him, took his hand, which was large and calloused from decades of work. Stayed like that for a time she didn't know how to measure. When she went to sleep, she took the card from her uniform pocket and placed it on top of the desk, where the bills and receipts and medical forms were. She stood looking at it once more, with that yellow light from the lamp that made everything a bit golden. Dr. Henrique Asunção. Mater Linguae Institute. No urgency. She turned off the light, lay down, stared at the ceiling in the dark for a few minutes, and then, with that decision that sometimes arrives not like a lightning bolt, but like a tide, silent and inevitable, she decided she would call. She didn't know yet what that call would mean. She didn't know what he wanted, what he had to offer, what he expected to find in a French restaurant waitress who had responded to a dinner request in the wrong language for the right person. But she had learned over the last 5 years that the opportunities that appeared without alarm were exactly the ones that needed the most attention, not the least. She slept with that certainty, and it was enough for that night. The next morning, before anything else, she made coffee, prepared her father's breakfast, helped him with the physical therapy exercises the doctor had prescribed to be done at home. Simple exercises, but ones that required patience and regularity. Seu Geraldo collaborated with that quiet determination that was perhaps the most striking characteristic of his character. He didn't complain, he didn't dramatize. He did what needed to be done with the seriousness of someone who understands that recovery is not an event, but a process, and that processes require discipline. She observed him during those moments with a mixture of feelings she had never managed to completely name. There was pride, there was love, there was that kind of soft pain that accompanies caring for someone who once cared for you, and there was also, increasingly rarely but still present, a sting of something she had learned not to call regret, because that name was unfair, but which was similar to it, the awareness of a path that had been left behind. At 10 in the morning, while her father watched the news with the volume low, Mara went to her room, took the card from the desk, and dialed the number. The phone rang twice. On the third, a voice answered, masculine, calm, without the rush of someone who expects an important call and needs to demonstrate it. Asunção. Dr. Henrique, Mara said, my name is Mara Cavalcante. I received your card at... I know who you are, he said without abruptness. Thank you for calling. I imagined it would take a few days. She stayed in silence for an instant. A few days was what it took. There was in that brief exchange something she recognized as the start of a conversation between 2 people who had become accustomed to weighing words before using them. A different cadence from what she was used to in the restaurant dining room, where each phrase had an immediate and practical function. I would like to invite you for a coffee, he said, not to make a formal proposal, just to talk. Would you be available any day this week? Mara mentally calculated the shift schedule, her father's appointment, the shopping day. Wednesday morning. Perfect. Do you know the cafe at the Institute of Advanced Studies at USP? She knew it. She had had coffee there dozens of times during her master's, at a specific table, near the window overlooking the garden of trumpet trees. I know it, she said. 10 o'clock. 10 o'clock. She hung up, stood with the phone in her hand for a few seconds, looking at the card she had left on the bed. Then she put it back on the desk, went to the living room, sat beside her father, and watched the news with him until lunchtime. On Wednesday, she woke up earlier than necessary. She prepared her father, organized the medications, left the day's instruction list for Donna Ivone, who had agreed to stay with him in the morning in exchange for help with the week's groceries, an arrangement they had established 2 years ago and that worked with the efficiency of things born from mutual necessity. She took the subway at Bras Station, transferred at Paraíso, got off at Butantã, and walked to the campus. São Paulo on a Wednesday morning had a different rhythm from other mornings. There was less rush than Monday, less resignation than Tuesday, a kind of provisional balance that people used to convince themselves the week was under control. On the USP campus, this rhythm became even smoother, replaced by that peculiar cadence of universities, which is at once urgent and circular, full of people who are going somewhere, but who are also, in a way, always returning to the same point. Mara arrived 10 minutes early. She ordered a simple coffee and waited at the table near the window. Not the one facing the trumpet trees. That one was occupied by 2 students with laptops. She went to the next one, which was slightly offset, from where she could see both the garden and the cafe entrance. Henrique Assunção arrived exactly at 10 o'clock. He wore a grey wool coat over a white shirt, no tie, no leather briefcase. He had the expression of someone who had decided that encounter was a conversation and not a meeting, and had dressed accordingly. He saw Mara, nodded briefly, ordered a coffee at the counter, and came to sit down. "Thank you for coming," he said. "The pleasure is mine," she replied. "I am curious." He smiled. It was a contained smile, which didn't try to fill more space than necessary. "Direct, good. Then I will be direct too." He wrapped his hands around the cup. "I was at Maison Verlaine last week by chance. I had scheduled a dinner with a partner who cancelled at the last minute, but I was already in Jardines and decided to have dinner anyway. I didn't expect to witness anything in particular." Mara waited. "But what happened that night left me thinking. Not just the incident with the card, that was the least interesting. What caught my attention was the way you responded to Drummond's French." He stopped. "You didn't just respond. You made a technical distinction between the use of the definite article and the partitive article in a specific culinary construction. That is not conversational level knowledge. That is training." Mara held his gaze. "It is training," she confirmed. "I researched your name afterward," he said, without apologizing for the information, just putting it on the table as a fact. "I saw the dissertation. I saw the article in the Portuguese journal. I saw the interrupted scholarship." A pause. "I know it's none of my business why you stopped, but I needed to understand who the person was who had made that distinction on a Thursday night between an appetizer and a dessert." "And now that you know," she asked, "now I want to tell you about the project." He leaned slightly forward. "The Mater Linguae Institute has been developing for 3 years a linguistic mapping of isolated speech communities in the interior of the state of São Paulo, specifically remnant Caipira communities in the Val do Ribeira and around the Pontal do Paranapanema. The goal is to document phonological and syntactic structures before urbanization and the media absorb them completely." He stopped. "You must be noticing the overlap." Mara had been noticing for 30 seconds. The Vale do Ribeira. That was exactly the region she had proposed as a research field in the doctoral scholarship she never started. The coincidence was so precise that for an instant she felt that soft vertigo of someone seeing a line she had imagined crossed return to the horizon. "Who conducts the mapping?" she asked. "A team of 3 researchers, but we lost the coordinator 2 months ago. She accepted a permanent position at Unicamp, which was an opportunity she couldn't refuse." He looked at her with that direct attention she had noticed on the first night. We are looking for someone who knows the theory, who has fieldwork capacity, and who understands that this type of research requires both rigor and patience. Those are qualities that don't appear together frequently. And you think I have those qualities based on a restaurant interaction? No. He shook his head slightly. I think so based on the master's dissertation, which I read in its entirety on Thursday night. The restaurant interaction was what led me to look for the name. Silence. The coffee cooled in the cups between them. Mara looked at the garden for a moment. The trumpet trees were in full bloom, that vibrant yellow that São Paulo offered a few weeks a year, as if it needed to justify itself. There was something almost theatrical in that coincidence of scenery, and she, who had studied the way language constructs meaning from context, did not fail to notice. You mentioned it wouldn't be a formal proposal today, she said, turning her eyes back to him. Correct. Today is a conversation. The formal proposal, if you are interested in hearing it, would come later. He raised his cup. But I can tell you in advance that it involves a senior researcher contract with full-time dedication, compensation compatible with the level of responsibility, and a benefits package that includes comprehensive medical assistance for the title holder and their direct dependents. Mara became absolutely still. She had learned over the years not to let things appear on her face before she had decided what to feel about them, but that last phrase hit a point she had trained less, the point where discipline and relief meet, and she felt, for a very brief second, her eyes burn. She blinked, breathed, maintained her expression. "Can I think about it?" she said. "Of course," he replied, and there was in that answer, simple as it was, the weight of someone who understands that some decisions need silence to settle. It took her 7 days to respond, not because she was in doubt about what she wanted, but because she had learned to distrust things that arrived with the appearance of a solution. Life had taught her, in sufficiently blunt ways, that the ground that seems firmest can give way exactly where you place the most weight. So she verified. She researched the Mater Linguae Institute with the same rigor with which she had reviewed bibliographies during her master's. She read the published reports. She verified the links with partner universities. She located 2 former researchers from the institute and contacted them by email, introducing herself as someone interested in the institution and asking about the work experience. The answers came in 2 days, both positive. One of them, from a researcher who had worked on the mapping of Quilombola speech in the Vale do Ribeira, said, "It is one of the few institutions in the country where what you produce matters more than where you came from." Mara reread that phrase 3 times. On the 7th day, she called Henrique Assunção and said she wanted to hear the formal proposal. He scheduled a meeting for the following week at the Institute's headquarters, in a renovated house on Avenida Brasil in Pinheiros, a 10-minute walk from the apartment she had sold 5 years ago to pay for her father's treatment. The meeting lasted 2 hours. There were 2 other people present besides Henrique, the administrative coordinator of the Institute, a woman named Beatriz who spoke fast and took notes while she spoke, and the most senior researcher of the field team, a man named Fabio, who had spent 3 years documenting rural dialects in the Northeast before joining the project. They presented the scope of the work, the methodology, the field schedule planned for the 2nd semester, and the contract. When Mara saw the compensation amount, she maintained the same expression as always. But inside she did the quick calculation that had become a reflex over the years. Her father's medications, the physical therapy, the speech therapy, the household bills. The number in the contract covered all of that with a margin, and the health plan was of the category that included hospitalization, high-complexity exams, and follow-up with specialists without a co-payment limit. It was exactly what her father needed, and what she had pursued in an indirect and insufficient way for 5 years. She signed the contract the next day, after taking it to be read by a lawyer who worked at a free legal clinic near her home. The lawyer said the contract was solid. She thanked him, went home, and sat at the kitchen table with the signed document in front of her. Seu Geraldo was in the living room armchair in his usual place. Mara went to him, sat in the same position as always, on the edge of the arm of the chair beside him. He looked at her. "Father," she said, "I am going back to research." He stayed in silence for a moment, Then slowly, with that effort she had learned to recognize as the most sincere form of communication he had available at the moment, he opened the hand that was resting on his lap and offered his palm up. She placed her hand over his. They stayed like that for a while. The television was muted. The creeper swayed slightly behind the living room window. At some point on the block, someone passed with a popcorn cart, the characteristic whistle cutting through the warm October afternoon air. It was at that moment, in that specific stillness, that Mara's phone vibrated with a message. It was from a number she didn't recognize immediately, but the name was saved in the sender's contact list, Raphael Drummond. She looked at the screen with that attention she reserved for unexpected things. The message said, "I heard you are going to work with Asunção. I am a partner in the group that finances Mata Lingue. We need to talk." Mara stared at the message for a long moment. Then she raised her eyes, looked at her father's face, he having closed his eyes without letting go of her hand, and took a deep breath. There was something almost comic in the precision of that coincidence, and she, who had dedicated years to the study of how language created patterns of meaning where there seemed to be only noise, could not fail to recognize the pattern. She responded with a single line. "You can schedule it with the administrative coordinator of the institute. Beatrice will set it up." She turned off the screen, put away the phone. 3 days later, in a glass meeting room at the institute, she and Henrique Asunção were sitting on the same side of the table when Raphael Drummond entered. He had arrived accompanied by a young assistant who carried a briefcase and stayed by the wall. Raphael was different from how he was on the night at the restaurant. Not less controlled, but different in the type of control. There was in his shoulders that afternoon something that looked more like restraint than arrogance. He saw Mara and stopped for a fraction of a second. Then he continued to the chair on the other side of the table and sat down. "Drummond," Henrique said, with that cordiality that doesn't need smiles to exist. "You know Dr. Mara Cavalcante, our new field research coordinator. We've already met," Raphael said dryly. "Yes," Mara confirmed, with the same tone as always. There was a pause that lasted exactly the time necessary for everyone in the room to understand what was being said, without anyone needing to say it. Raphael opened the briefcase the assistant had placed on the table. "I came for the meeting to review the financial contribution for the second semester." He looked at the documents. Then he raised his eyes to Mara, and in that look there was something she hadn't seen on the night at the restaurant, something that wasn't exactly regret, but was a neighbor to it. "The group approves the continuation of the funding, in full." "Great," Henrique said. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. It was technical, objective, without detours. Raphael presented the numbers. Henrique responded with the progress report. Mara asked 3 questions about the field schedule that the assistant noted down. At the end, when everyone was getting up, Raphael stayed a moment longer than necessary by his chair. "You made a correct distinction that night," he said low, without looking at Henrique, just at her. "The reduction de cassis. I had studied French enough to feel secure, but not enough to really know." Mara looked at him. There was no triumph in that moment. It had never been about triumph. "The distinction doesn't change the flavor of the dish," she said with simplicity, "but it changes what you are saying about it." He stayed in silence for a second. Then he made that brief nod of the head which, coming from him in that context, meant more than anything else he could have said. He left. The assistant followed him. Henrique looked at Mara with an expression she was beginning to learn to read. "Did you know he was a partner in the funding group?" "No," she said, "but it wouldn't have changed anything." He nodded slowly. "I know." A pause. "That is why you are here." Mara left the institute at 4 in the afternoon. She walked down Avenida Brazil toward the subway with that same cadence as always, shoes on the asphalt, bag on her shoulder, the city around her doing what it always did. But there was something different in that walk, something she took a few steps to identify. It was lightness, not the lightness of someone who carries nothing, but a different lightness, that of someone who carries the same weight as always and realizes her shoulders are finally enough for it. It was an old sensation whose name she had forgotten, Only upon entering the subway, settling into the blue plastic seat with the city disappearing beneath the ground, did she find the exact word: hope. That was it. Hope with structure, with a signed contract, with a start date. The kind that doesn't ask permission to exist. The first day of work at the Mater Linguae Institute fell on a Monday in November, when São Paulo was still calibrating between the heat that wanted to come and the rain that still hesitated. Mara arrived at 9 o'clock, half an hour earlier than agreed, which was a habit she had never managed to abandon and had stopped trying to. Beatrice received her with a coffee and a folder of documents. Fabio received her with a firm handshake and a map unfolded on the table, already covered in notes and markings in 3 different colors. Enrique arrived at 5 to 10, left a phrase of welcome that was at once cordial and objective, and went to his office to resolve a matter that had arrived by email. It was an environment that functioned with the quiet efficiency of places where people like what they do. Mara sat at the desk that had been prepared for her and stood looking at the files Beatrice had left. They were the field records of the work done in the previous 2 years, phonetic transcriptions, catalogued audio recordings, interviews with elderly speakers from communities in the Vale do Ribeira. She opened the first file, and she remembered everything. Not in a dramatic way, not like a movie restarting from the beginning, but like a musician who picks up the instrument after years and realizes the hands still know what the head forgot. The symbols of the International Phonetic Alphabet, which she had memorized during undergraduate school as if they were a second alphabet, returned with a naturalness that surprised her. The structure of the transcriptions, the way of marking the stressed syllable, the notation system for the voiced fricatives that the caipira from the interior of São Paulo produced, in a slightly different way than the urban standard. It was all there, intact, waiting. She worked the entire morning without getting up from the desk. At 12:30, Fabio knocked on her office door and said they were going to lunch if she wanted to come along. She went. They sat at a bakery on the corner, Beatrice, Fabio and her, and ate a coccinha and cheese pastel, with that relaxation of colleagues who are still getting to know each other but already know they will get along. Fabio told stories about the field, the dirt roads of the Vale do Ribeira in the rainy season, the recorders that stopped working in the humidity, the speakers who distrusted the microphone but told entire stories as soon as he put the equipment away. "The best recording I ever made," he said, biting into the pastel, "was an 83-year-old lady who told me the legend of the headless mule in a variant I had never seen recorded anywhere. But I was with the recorder battery at 0, so I had to do phonetic notation by hand, while she spoke, trying not to lose her rhythm." "Did you manage?" Mara asked. "About 70% of the relevant phonemic occurrences." He made a face of regret. The other 30% stayed with her. Beatrice laughed. Mara did too, with that laugh that comes from an authentic place and not from social obligation. They returned to the institute. Mara spent the afternoon organizing the field schedule for the following semester, based on the files and the maps. At 5 in the afternoon, Enrique stopped at her office door. "How was the first day?" She raised her eyes. "Good. Better than I expected. And I expected a lot." He smiled with that characteristic restraint. "There is something I want to tell you. It wouldn't change anything, and I know that. But I think you deserve to know." He entered the room, stood without sitting down, like someone who wants the conversation to be brief. "Your name had reached me before the night at Maison Verlaine." Mara became still. "I was one of the external evaluators of your doctoral proposal in 2020. The scholarship you didn't end up starting." He looked at her with that direct attention she had already learned to recognize. "Your proposal was approved unanimously. When you communicated your withdrawal, the committee was—" He paused, choosing the word. "Disappointed is insufficient. We didn't understand. The letter you sent was clear, but the reasons you presented were generic. No one knew what had happened." Mara held his gaze. "They were personal reasons." "I know that now." A pause. "When I saw you at the restaurant and you responded to Drummond the way you did, I didn't connect the name immediately. But there was something in the way you positioned yourself, The technical precision, the accuracy, the calm, that sounded familiar to me in a way I couldn't name. It was only when I researched the name that I understood where that familiarity came from. Silence. The afternoon light entered through the office window at that golden angle that happened in November when the sun was lower on the horizon and transformed any common surface into something that looked painted. "Were you looking for the research coordinator before seeing me at the restaurant?" she asked. "We'd been looking for 2 months, but the coincidence was real, if that is what you are asking." He crossed his arms slightly. "I didn't orchestrate anything. I was dining alone because the partner cancelled. I saw what happened, I researched the name, and I understood that the person who had left research 5 years ago for reasons that were never clear still had everything that had impressed me in the original proposal, plus 5 years of something that academia rarely offers." "What is it?" "Reality," he said simply. "Contact with the world outside of books, which is, curiously, the only place where language actually exists." Mara stayed in silence for a moment. There was something in that revelation that was at once surprising and not surprising, like when you find the answer to a problem and realize you had passed near it several times without recognizing it. "You said it wouldn't change anything," she said, finally. "It wouldn't," he confirmed. "You signed the contract because you verified the institution, because you consulted former researchers, because you read the reports, not because I convinced you." He made that brief nod of the head. "The decision was yours, that is what matters." He left. Mara stood looking at the schedule on the computer screen. Then she looked at the window, at the light that was changing color as the afternoon advanced. She thought of her father at home, of the large and calloused hand offered with the palm up. She thought of the business card that had stayed 3 days on the desk before she picked up the phone. She thought of the night at the restaurant, of Raphael Drummond's exaggerated French, of the way she had responded without thinking, by pure reflex from years of study that had never gone anywhere, just waited. There was a linguistic theory she had read during her master's in an article by a Danish researcher, which said that embodied knowledge, that which the body learns before the mind processes, never fully erases. It can remain in silence, but silence is not absence, it is latency. She had remained in silence for 5 years. And then, on a Thursday night in a restaurant in Jardines, the silence had ended. Not with a shout, not with a proclamation, with a phrase, with a grammatical distinction in a language she had learned for the love of knowledge and that she had carried like someone carries a precious object on a long crossing without knowing exactly what they will need it for, but unable to abandon it on the way. The right language, said at the right moment, had been enough. Sometimes that's it. Sometimes an answer is enough. A phrase. A choice not to remain silent when it would be easier to remain silent. Mara turned off the monitor, stood up, grabbed her bag. Through the Institute's hallway, the late afternoon lights painted the floor orange. She went out to the street with the same step as always, firm, without hurry, toward the subway and the bus and the house in Ipiranga, where the hallway light would be on waiting for her. 6 months later, the Val do Ribeira was in the middle of the rainy season when Mara's team arrived at the Ivaporunduva community. It was an April morning, the sky low and heavy over the Ribeira de Iguape, the smell of wet earth mixed with the smoke from houses that still cooked with wood. Fabio drove the Institute's white Hilux along a dirt road that in some stretches was more river than road, while Mara sat in the passenger seat with the field notebook on her lap and headphones around her neck, listening to recordings from the previous session. She had changed, in ways that were visible to those who knew her and invisible to those who didn't. She hadn't changed in a dramatic way, she hadn't become another person. But there was in her now a different presence, the kind that happens when someone stops spending energy being what they are not and starts using that same energy being what they are. It was subtle, it was consistent, it was real. The fieldwork was exactly as Fabio had described, difficult, imprecise, full of moments when the equipment failed, and what remained was the manual notation and memory. But it was also exactly as she had imagined during the years of theoretical research, alive. The people they interviewed were not sources of abstract data. They were people with names, stories, particular ways of constructing a phrase that carried centuries of adaptation and survival. Each recording session was, at once, a scientific record and an act of preservation of something that time was, slowly, swallowing. She had presented the first partial report to the Institute in March. Henrique had read it in silence for 20 minutes while she waited on the other side of the table, and then he had closed the document and said only, "Continue." It was the most precise praise she had received in years. Seu Geraldo had started the new phase of treatment with the Institute's health plan in January. The neurologist had adjusted the medication, including a new therapeutic approach that until then was financially out of their reach. In March, during a speech therapy session, he had said his daughter's name spontaneously, without stimulus from the therapist. The specialist had documented it. Mara had found out by text message while she was on her way to the Institute, on the subway, and had stood with the phone in her hand looking at the word on the screen for 3 whole stops without moving. Mara? Just her name, but with the entire extent of a whole vocabulary behind it. In the following weeks, her father's words returned slowly, one at a time, like someone crossing a narrow bridge and testing each board before putting their weight down. Coffee was the second. Good morning was the third, said on a Saturday morning when Mara entered the room with the breakfast tray, and he was looking at the window with that expression of someone who returned from a long trip and is learning the contours of the familiar place again. She placed the tray on the table beside the bed, sat on the edge of the mattress, and stayed there until he finished eating, without hurry, without unnecessary questions. There was between them, in that period, a communication that did not depend on words, built over decades and reinforced by the months of forced silence, a language of its own made of small gestures and looks, and the willingness to be present without demanding anything in return. Cecilia, the woman who had been with Raphael Drummond on the night at the restaurant, had sent a message to the Institute 2 months after the incident. Not to Mara directly, but to the Human Resources Department, asking if there were opportunities for volunteer work in educational projects linked to the Institute. Beatrice had passed the message to Mara, who had responded with information about the external collaboration program. They had met once on a February afternoon to have coffee and talk about the project. Cecilia had stopped working with Raphael 3 months prior. She was pursuing a postgraduate degree in cultural management. There was in her eyes that afternoon that expression of someone who found the ground after a time without finding it. They hadn't talked about the night at the restaurant. There had been no need. Raphael Drummond had continued in the Institute's group of financiers. The quarterly meetings were conducted with objectivity by both sides. There was between them now a kind of functional distance, not cold, but calibrated, the type of relationship established when 2 people decide, without explicitly negotiating, that the work is greater than the discomfort. He had, in one of the meetings, asked a technical question about the transcription methodology that revealed he had, in fact, read the partial report. It was the kind of small thing that meant more than it seemed. On that April afternoon in the Val do Ribeira, while Fabio prepared the equipment in a wattle and daub house where an 81-year-old lady had agreed to talk to them, Mara stood in the yard for a few minutes. The Ribeira River flowed on the other side of the dense forest, and the sound of the water arrived muffled by the trees. There were bird songs she didn't know how to name, and the kitchen smoke rose in a straight line because there was no wind. She thought of everything that had led to that yard. The years of study, the years of service, the years of impossible balance. The father who had taught her to pedal without warning, he had let go of the seat. Professor Mireles, who had said not to lose the thread. The French she had never let go of, even without needing it for anything other than taking orders in a restaurant. The distinction between the definite article and the partitive article in a culinary construction, pronounced on a Thursday night, before a man who had underestimated her because underestimating waitresses was easier than learning to listen to them. There was a phrase that returned frequently in recent months, not as a formed thought but as a sensation, a kind of certainty that didn't need an argument to sustain itself. It was the phrase from the article she had underlined in red during her master's, the one about language as a system of survival. She had understood the phrase intellectually when she had read it for the first time. It had taken 5 years, a French restaurant in Jardins, a business card left in a locker, and a father who recovered his words one by one to understand it completely. Language is not just a system of communication, it is a system of survival. People carry in the way they speak the entire history of what they needed to be to continue existing. And she had continued existing, and she had continued speaking. And the right language, said at the right moment to the wrong person, had changed everything. The thread. She hadn't lost the thread. The 81-year-old lady appeared at the kitchen door and called out, "Girl, are you coming in or not?" Mara smiled. "I am, ma'am." And she went in. Dear listeners, if Mara Cavalcante's story touched something inside you, if at any moment you saw yourself in that waitress who carried a world no one saw, in this father who offered the palm of his hand without needing words, then you know that stories like this need to continue being told. Here on the channel Noites de Lendas Esquecidas, every week we bring narratives that explore what is truest in the human experience, silent resilience, the talents the world ignores, the turns that arrive not like thunder, but like the tide. If this story reached you, subscribe to the channel right now and activate the notification bell, because the next story is already on its way, and it was also made for you. Leave your comment below. Would you have believed in Mara from the start, or would you need her to prove herself first? And if someone around you carries a hidden universe that the world hasn't seen yet, share this video with that person. Sometimes the right story arrives at the right moment, and that is no coincidence. Until the next night. End of story.